So excited to be helping to kick off day 3 of the Law Firm Growth Conference, seeing what I can do to help you have less stress in your practice, even as that practice continues to grow. I'm Belle Walker. I'm the founder and CEO of Bellevue Consulting. Today, we're going to be talking about going from friction to function. It's one of my absolute favorite topics. And we're going to be looking today at the power of process in helping get from those pain points and discomfort to what really feels like a sustainable and highly functional organization. To set the stage, I'm going to start off by telling a story that was primarily inspired by one client, but reflects a situation that I have seen over and over again. This was a law firm that happened to be in the employment law space, but this situation is probably going to sound familiar to quite a few of you. I was working with them on their client onboarding process, going all the way from the first contact and getting to know the clients. So from an early lead through getting the client fully configured and ready to begin work together. When we started looking at that process, I realized that there was a pretty major pain point around the conflict of interest check. Pretty much every lawyer I know needs to do conflict of interest checks, not just employment law firms. And what we found was that this was a concept that was causing a ton of frustration. What was happening was that over and over again, the conflict of interest check was being completed, and then the lawyer would spend, a partner would spend quite a bit of time really getting to know the client and their needs. And then down the line, a couple weeks later, or even days later, all of a sudden there was a conflict. And this was causing a ton of frustration for everyone. The partners felt like these conflicts were being missed. They had been told the conflict of interest check was completed. The admins, paralegals were frustrated, and we'll get into a little bit of why in a minute. And the clients were frustrated. Everyone was putting all this time into doing conflict of interest checks and getting to know each other and getting everything, the relationships established, only to have it all fall apart. Now, I'm guessing that many of you are thinking, yeah, what the heck were the paralegals and the admin staff doing here? And it turns out that there was a challenge around what exactly we were talking about when we said conflict of interest check. What was actually going on was that there were 2 different conflict of interest checks that needed to happen. And as soon as I explain this, you're all going to be saying, oh, yeah, that totally makes sense. Because when these leads were first coming in, there was only so much information available. Pretty much a name, a company, sometimes only one or the other. And so the preliminary conflict of interest check was very high level, and there was additional information that was needed to do the full due diligence. And so on the admin side, it was pretty clear there were 2 conflict of interest checks, but there was only one phrase being used to refer to both of these different processes. And so we were able to uncover this through process mapping together, because we found that the conflict of interest box kept moving. And when we really dug into it, we realized that's because there were 2 boxes. And so we were able to clarify, this is the preliminary conflict of interest check. Here's the additional information that's needed for a full conflict of interest check. And that allowed the partners to more accurately set expectations with clients around what these preliminary conversations should and should not, or must not include, so that everyone made the most effective use of their time. And that's a pretty long story for why can't we be more specific about our words? But what I found was that as all of this tension was going on, there was a lot of frustration around accountability, right? The paralegals, the administrative team, felt like they were being held to an impossible standard. They were supposed to be providing feedback about conflict of interest before they had the information they needed, and they thought that was the partners pushing accountability off of their plates onto them, because the partners were supposed to be finding that information. Of course, the partners felt like the paralegal team was not taking accountability for conflict of interest checks early and often as they were expected to. And the clients were feeling like the whole firm was falling down on the job. This type of situation, these types of conflicts arise all the time. It's so difficult to know where things are going wrong until you really start digging in to understand what about the way we've always done things is working and what's not working. And so the question is there a better way to uncover these tension points and instead of letting them fester until someone like me shows up and starts really digging in? And I think that there is. Before we get to what the better way is, let's start with some of the signals you might be hearing that tell you, oh, it's time to be thinking about whether or not we should be reflecting and revising the ways that we're working together. The first, one of my favorites, that wasn't my job. This is one of the really common confusion points, and it manifested in the story I just told because the paralegals were pretty clear. Doing a full, deep conflict of interest check before the information was available was not their job. It was an impossible ask. It was not something that they had ever thought they were asked to do. And so they were quite literally saying, that wasn't my job. My job was to run the preliminary conflict of interest check. There just wasn't the terminology to make that distinction. Similarly, the I couldn't have done that anyway. In this particular case, you could frame it both directions. There simply wasn't the information available to do the early conflict of interest check, even though that's what they thought they were being asked to do. And they felt like they were handling it. There's a lot of this gesture associated with these moments, I have found. And so from the administrative perspective, they were doing exactly what they had been asked, trained, and expected to do. Preliminary checks up front, deeper checks after that information became available. That being said, there are certainly times when there are just straight up mistakes. That's not the particular story I was telling, but there are certainly situations where no matter how well everyone is planning, there will be human error. So we're going to talk through all of these different elements as we go through. So I've been talking a lot about accountability and ownership and not really so much process, even though I started out by saying this talk is going to be about process. And now is maybe a good time to talk about how these things come together. What can we do differently? I think first and foremost, taking a step back and approaching accountability as a process rather than a moment is going to truly help your firm get onto the right foot where your stress is going to be lower because you're able to work through some of these conflicts early and often before the stress ratchets out of control. Now, when I say accountability as a process, I'm talking about three fairly basic steps: setting the stage, engaging the team, and then reflecting and adjusting. Of course, if you've worked with me or talked with me in depth about process, I really like to layer the amount of detail. So for setting the stage, there's more to it than simply, oh, we should talk about accountability. And in fact, there are 5 key components when we talk about setting the stage around accountability as a process. The first is making sure that you have clarity around the roles and responsibilities within your firm. And there are some things that are going to be very clear up front, right? The training of a lawyer versus a paralegal versus purely administrative staff are going to look very different. There can also be a lot of fuzzy areas, particularly around research, information management, and those tend to be the gotchas because the core of the roles may be super clear, but the details and the nuances, the edges are where we start to get ourselves into a little bit of confusion. And so when I'm talking about roles and responsibilities, a job description is a great start, but it's not enough, right? It's really making sure that you have fully developed the roles, the responsibilities, and what they look like in practice to help avoid those "that wasn't my job" moments and the "I couldn't have done that anyways." By having a deeper conversation, you can start to surface times when you need something from an employee. If you have articulated it clearly, that helps you get around, especially if you've documented it, right? That helps you get around the "that was not my job." Yes, it was. We wrote it down. At the same time, when you are having that review with the team member, it gives them an opportunity to say, "I couldn't have done that. That's not how my skill set works. That's not the information that I have available." Excuse me. And so those moments really are going to help prevent a lot of the stress that can build and build in an organization. Now, when you're clear on your roles and responsibilities, you are also going to have to pick priorities. That means there's going to need to be some favorites. One of my favorite little factoids that I very carefully do not research because I prefer to believe it is true is the notion that the word priorities was not historically pluralized, that priority was a singular and it was not considered a concept that could have multiples. There was a priority. And one of the biggest traps that I tend to see people fall into is having too many competing priorities, where even if some small progress is able to be made on all of the priorities, it doesn't feel like progress because nothing is actually reaching completion. So when we're talking about setting the stage, being clear on those roles and responsibilities and top priority focus areas goes a very long way to positioning your team and your entire firm for success. I also am partial to a tool called process mapping. And so process maps are a great way of really formalizing everything we've talked about so far, the roles, the responsibilities, the priorities, clarifying what must be done, what ends up being a conditional or secondary requirement. And I like it particularly because of the visualization. I mentioned in that first story that we kept moving a conflict of interest box, and that visualization of literally taking this thing that was happening and seeing where it went in the process was what really helped spark the conversation around, no, wait, there are two. There are two of these conflict of interest checks happening. So this is a case study that I really like to use that is not about conflict of interest, but instead looking at invoicing, and particularly for partners who were concerned about the flow of money, and also had some concerns about the efficiency of their staff. Not a lack of trust situation. This was a firm that had merged relatively recently, or formed out of two firms that had merged, and only one person at that point really understood the firm's finances. So you had this interesting combination of legacy systems coming together with a small knowledge base, only one expert. And it was a great time to really take a step back and see where we could document the the situation and the challenges, and where we could find opportunities for higher efficiency. And so this is a great example of a flow chart. We tend to use just a handful of symbols for some pretty clear visual language that helps everyone get on the same page. We start at the right-hand side with the oval. It says invoicing cycle starts. And those oval shapes tell us that we are starting or ending a process. These squares or rectangles are a step in the process. It's a thing that happens, and then the next thing happens. Whereas our diamonds are decision points. So we will follow the arrows right out of the squares and rectangles, but for our decision points, we have to pick either our yes or our no path. So for this initial invoicing flow, the invoicing cycle would start and they would create something called pre-bills. The partners would review the pre-bills and make any corrections that were needed. And if corrections were needed, in this particular case, the corrections were made and then immediately the invoices were generated. Then the partners would review the invoices, make corrections, and then they would continue to review the invoices until there were no more corrections needed. Then the final invoices would be generated and sent. Now, the reason they reviewed those pre-bills was because there were certain accounts, older accounts within their system, where the act of generating the invoices that first time actually triggered the transfer of money. So the pre-bills for those accounts really, really needed to be correct, or you could end up in a pretty precarious situation where money had been transferred unintentionally. So we looked at this process, the orange is the work that was being done by the partners, and said, there's a couple places where I think we can be quite a bit more efficient. And this is one of the most important points I want to make today, which is that more boxes does not necessarily mean more complexity or more stress or more inefficiency. It can be very tempting to want to have that flow at the top and think, man, yeah, that is the most effective and efficient way to do that. And it is likely the simplest when you have fewer boxes. But what we found was that when we revised the invoicing flow to add a little bit more nuance, we were able to make a big difference. So specifically, we started by only having the partners review the pre-bills for those accounts that needed to be correct. The formatting of the pre-bills was a mess. It was taking the partners a very long time to review them. And so we were able to save some time right up front. It did require a little more time from the administrative staff, which was counter to what the partners had originally been thinking. They had been expecting to optimize the administrative staff's work, but we realized that in adding a little more complexity for them, we could save quite a bit of partner time, which was a huge win for the firm overall. Then, after the partners reviewed the invoices, there's a nuance here. You may remember on the last slide, the corrections were made and the partners reviewed the invoices. That was not a typo or a weird implication, a hidden nuance. The partners were reviewing the full stack of invoices for their clients every time the corrections were made. And so what we decided to consider was only reviewing the invoices that had been edited. Now, this may seem very straightforward, and this was absolutely something the partners have previously considered. The reason they had chosen not to do that in the past was they were concerned that they were overlooking additional errors, right? They realized they were not infallible and that it was possible they had missed errors the first time around. So to really maximize the quality of invoices and correctness of what they were delivering to their clients, they were intentionally reviewing the invoices over and over and over again. Fortunately, that also meant we had some data. So we knew we were able to go back and see that, yes, they did catch additional errors, but it was on the order of 1 to 5 errors, total errors, not entirely incorrect invoices or multiple errors on an invoice. 1 to 5 errors per partner per year on those secondary or tertiary reviews. And so they were able to make a very conscious choice that, yes, there might be some errors that sneak through this way, but they will be so few and far between that the hours of review that could be saved were a trade-off they were comfortable making. And now they didn't have to make that choice, but making the choice consciously in either direction meant that they were now taking more ownership and reducing the stress associated with either seeing that an error came through because they had made that accepted that option intentionally, and conversely, if they had continued to spend the time doing those reviews, they would have been really clear on why that's where their time was going. So to summarize all of that pretty quickly, the firm-wide clarity was really valuable to the partners, and we ended up saving about 2 hours of partner time per partner per month. And it really did make a huge difference to be able to call out where these things like culture of perfection at all costs and the preference for just doing what we know had caused some of these underlying stress points to creep in. All right, so process maps is a third part of setting the stage, making sure that everyone on your team is clear about what they do, what the top priorities are, and how they're going to go about executing. There's also an important need for check-ins, for making sure that once you have started some of these conversations, that you're not just assuming that you said it once out loud and you're done. By being able to have early and often refreshers, making sure that the information you communicated is the information that was received, can really help with stress reduction. And asking for help. This is something that can be shockingly difficult, not just for lawyers and partners, but in law firms in general. This tends to be an environment where the perfection is lauded, right? A lot of lawyers, and this may be you, this may be colleagues, people you've seen, really hold themselves to a high standard, right? You all are intelligent professionals who have put a lot of time and energy into perfecting your craft, and there's not a ton of room for error in the work that you do. The challenge is finding the balance between encouraging people to ask for help when they need it and holding people to the standards that you're establishing. And so this is a bit of a nuanced point, making sure that you have explicitly established easy times where people can ask for help, for feedback, for support. That comes right back to the check-ins. Having a regular check-in where someone can say, oh, by the way, can go a very long way towards making sure that these requests for help happen on time when they need to, instead of when things have gone way off the rails. Our threshold for bringing something up in a conversation that's already happening is going to be much lower than reaching out to someone to ask for support. So that's setting the stage. That is the vast majority of what is going to be so crucial for establishing accountability as a process and processes more broadly that are going to help reduce your stress as your firm grows. Having those clear roles and responsibilities, articulating the top priorities, ensuring you've got process maps and other process documentation so people know how they're expected to do achieve those priorities within their roles and responsibilities, making sure you've got status checks and enabling team members to ask for help before things go off the rails. So coming back up one more level, that is setting the stage. So now let's talk about engaging the teams. The good news is, once you've set the stage, you should find yourself talking about accountability a lot less. And you have to put everything into action, making sure that all of that work continues from the foundational level, and that the work of your law firm is actually getting done as you expected. I often tell people that the chances we're going to get everything right on paper up front are low. And that's okay. What we need is something that is good enough to get going and figure out where reality and theory start to diverge. So engaging is really all about doing that exploration of saying, here's the stage we set. Does this work for us? Because that brings us right to the third piece where we need to reflect and adjust. And there are two main types of events that can trigger the need to reflect and adjust. I really like this chart because it helps distinguish between inadvertent and deliberate failures. Now, we're not going to talk much about the deliberate failure side. That honestly gets into more of an HR fit. There's not a ton of options I am well positioned to address when there are deliberate errors being made. When there's inadvertent errors, there's action errors and thinking errors. And so the action errors are when the plan is good, the process is good, and the execution fell down, right? And those are opportunities for performance improvement, for review, for discussion, for training. And then there's the thinking errors where maybe that process didn't have all the pieces we needed. And that comes back to this sort of reflect and adjust on the stage that we've set. And so there's just a great reference I want to call in for future reading, which is Amy Edmondson's work around types of failures. She was one of the pioneers around psychological safety and now has a more recent book that's all about different types of failures, failing well, and making sure that as often as possible, the failures that do happen fall into the intelligent uh, category where we're learning from the failures and we're able to bring those pieces back together. And so this is a process, accountability is a process. You can also view it as a cycle because one of the key things you're going to need to do is then reset the stage over and over again. That can also come in with the oopses. Remember, we really have been focusing on the first three of those excuses that tend to come up when there's accountability challenges that cause so much stress. And so this is kind of that last piece of making sure that in your organization that is made up of fallible humans, you have plans in place to identify and address any of those oopses that will pop up. So I want to round out with a few more actionable strategies for you. For example, some reflection questions. This is an opportunity for you to sit down and ask yourself, are the roles and responsibilities clear across your team? If you have partners and associates, where are the lines around who is doing what? Is there clarity? Are there things that are either being done twice as often as they need or falling through the gaps? And particularly looking at where there might be administrative nuance across the even more wildly different roles in your firm. Priorities, one thing that I talked about is setting the priorities, but you do also have to communicate them and keep them up to date. The idea that the priorities you set today are going to be exactly what you need tomorrow is lovely and unlikely. Well, hopefully tomorrow, but a year from now, it might look different. And if you're operating off of one set of priorities, but you haven't clearly communicated and documented and updated that knowledge, the rest of the team might be working on something totally different, not out of any lack of confidence, just a lack of awareness and knowledge. Making sure you have process maps or other documentation for your core functions is going to go a long way towards helping reduce that stress and make sure people are on the same page. Ensuring you have those regular status checks so that the barrier for asking for help is clear, and making sure that your team knows when they are expected to ask for help. Accountability is your secret weapon, and accountability is a process. So to round us out, how to take it from here, couple options. Hopefully this talk gave you a lot of great ideas. You're good to go. Sweet. Still not sure where to start. You can always sit down and think about a recent failure, a time where accountability came up recently, or listen for that word coming up moving forward when you hear yourself talking about accountability, when you hear others talking about accountability. Go back to those reflection questions and see where there might be some gaps. And last but not least, I've got an offer that can help jumpstart some of this work for your firm. And this is the process mapping starter kit for law firms that focuses specifically on onboarding, invoicing, and quality control. So it comes with 3 standard process maps and then an hour consultation for exploration and customization. Be delighted to talk through this with any of you and make sure that that link is available after the session. So as you may have noticed, I'm not actually here right now, so I can't answer your questions in real time, but I would love to address anything that does come up. So please reach out if you do have questions or anything further you want to talk through. Hopefully that this has given you a little more insight into ways to think about accountability and process within your firm. And I can't wait for you to spend the rest of today diving even deeper into how you can reduce your stress. Thank you so much.